Hi, this is Rob. I wanted to make this video as a follow-up to the AJAX via XML HTTP request object video I created earlier in this playlist. In this video, I'll show you how to use the JavaScript Fetch API to load external data. In this example, I've kept the function that uses the XML HTTP request method so we can compare the differences with the Fetch API. If you watched the prior video on this topic, you'll remember that using the XML HTTP request, we instantiate an instance of the object, put it in the constant request, and then call the open method, making an HTTP GET for the file at the path passed in as a parameter. We then call send on the request object. We listen for the onReady state change event to fire, and when it does, we execute this anonymous function and check the ready state for a value of 4 and a status of 200. If these both evaluate to true, then we know we have a successful response, and we can call json.parse to pass the text response into a JSON object. I then write it to the console and pass the contacts to the process data function. Process data simply traverses the contacts that were passed in as the parameter, getting the name, email, and cell for the contact, and then using those values to instantiate a new instance of a contact object. The contact object is created using the contact constructor function in the contact.js file. Once a new instance of a contact is instantiated, it's passed to the add contact method, which dynamically creates HTML elements, sets their attributes, and appends them to the DOM. Looking at the file that's loaded via AJAX, it's the contacts.json file, which is an array of object literals. So if we jump into the browser, we see when the page is loaded, we have a list of contacts, which are dynamically appended to the DOM using the data that's returned in the AJAX call. When using the Fetch API, it provides a fetch method which, when invoked, starts the process of asynchronously fetching a resource from a server and returns a promise that resolves to a response object. This functionality was previously achieved using XML HTTP request. Now, notice that I said the method asynchronously fetches a resource. This means that the request to fetch the object is sent while additional processing can occur. When the response is returned from the server, the data can then be processed. So basically, we're using JavaScript to make an asynchronous call to the server, then waiting for the response to come back in the background. In this function, I'm using the async keyword to indicate that this function will be executed asynchronously. The fetch method is used to fetch the data from the server asynchronously, and then the await keyword tells JavaScript to wait for the response to come back. Then it assigns the value that's returned from the fetch, which is the data in the contacts.json file, and assigns it as the value to the data constant. I can then take the data and call the text method to get the text value from the data that was returned and parse it into a JSON object. Then take the object and pass it to the process data function. So if we go back to the browser and refresh the page, we see the same result. If I go to the network tab and look at the request for the contacts.json file, we see that it was requested via a fetch, and if we look at the response, we'll see the array of object literals. Now, if we look at this function, we'll see that I'm using the promise-based implementation of fetch, where the then methods are used to perform additional processing after the response is returned. So in this case, we make a fetch for the data file. Then, when the response is returned, we'll pass the response as data into an ES6 arrow function calling text on the data. Then we'll pass the text as data into another arrow function, then parse the data and put the value into the context constant. And then once again, pass the context to the process data function. And refreshing the page, again shows the same response. Of the three methods shown in this example, this is the one you'll most likely encounter in modern JavaScript development, unless, of course, the application is using the jQuery JavaScript library, which will be the topic of the next video in this playlist. Before concluding this video, however, I'd like to show you an example of handling errors in the response. So in this function, once again, I'm passing the path to the data file in and then fetching the data. Then, when the response comes back, I'll pass the response into this arrow function. Then I'll check to see if the response property is not equal to OK. If that is the fact that the response was not OK, then an error occurred. I'll throw a new instance of an error passing the status text from the response object. And then once this error is thrown, I'll catch it and then write the error to the console. If it's the case that the response is OK, then I'll return the text from the response, then take that text as data, once again parse it, and then pass it to the process data function. So in this case, where I'm sending the path to the context.json file, if I go back to the browser and refresh, we see we have a good result. However, if I jump back into the code and change the name of the JSON file to a file that doesn't exist, and then go back to the browser, we see that we get a 404 trying to access the file that doesn't exist. Then we write the error not found to the console. Again, if we go back and change the name of the file to context.json, now we're able to load the file and dynamically display the data on the page. So that concludes this video on using the JavaScript Fetch API to fetch external data via AJAX. I hope you found this useful.